When you're speaking to your audience, you need to connect with your audience. You need to have some way of connecting with your audience, not only for the speech itself, but afterwards. There has to be something in your speech that sticks in people's mind. Some sort of phrase. Some sort of phrase that remains there. Some sort of phrase that stays. And it's not enough to have the phrase stay for just a while, just a little bit. You want that phrase to stay a long time. So remember, oh yeah, I remember you said that. You want to have a phrase that will change people's lives long after you speak. A phrase that gets people interested and thinking in a different way long after your speech is over, is done. You want a phrase that will stay with you for days. That's the goal. That's what you want to create. And for a long time I started to try to figure out what that phrase would be. How do you create those phrases? How do you make them? Because I knew they were so very, very important. And I'd give speeches and they'd be okay, but after a while I'd talk to a person and say, hey, you remember that speech I gave? And they'd say, yeah, Tim, I remember the speech. It was about the car or something. Speech didn't remain with them. There's nothing for them to hold on to. There's no phrase there for them to really grab a hold of. So, I struggled with speeches for years. How do you really get a hold of that? How do you really make that stick? How do you get that phrase that will stay with you for days? How do you get that to happen? And I studied a bunch of things, and then finally I discovered from really great speakers the secrets as they started talking about what they did. And one thing was the idea of a foundational phrase. And Craig Valentine, world champion speaker, called it a foundational phrase. Darren LaCroix talks about this sort of thing. Ed Tate talks about these things. All these really great speakers talk about the importance of getting this phrase. This all-important phrase that people remember. Oh yeah, they remember the phrase, they remember the speech, they remember your message. Long after you've given your speech, you're done, you moved on, the message remains. The audience remembers that message. And there's a phrase that will stay with you for days. And as I studied from these people, I started to understand things, and I took down what the method was. And that's what I want to share with you today. How you can have a phrase that will stay with your audience for days. You can create that. There's several things you need to be aware of, several things you need to be thinking about, and that's what we're going to cover. That's what we're going to go into. Because if you don't connect with your audience, if you don't have a lasting phrase, sure, you'll do okay for a while. It'll be fine. People won't remember it. They won't continue with it. Your message will get lost in all the clutter going on in their lives. However, if you have a foundational phrase, a solid one, if you have a phrase that stays with you for days, then people will remember it, they'll think about it, they'll remember the phrase, they'll remember the speech, they'll remember all the things you talked about. They'll get it, they'll understand. So today you will learn about the foundational phrase and the basics of the foundational phrase. You'll discover all the things that need to be in a foundational phrase. You'll find out the power of the foundational phrase, the power you can bring to your next speech by putting in a foundational phrase, step by step by step. We're going to cover the several things you need to know to have a foundational phrase, how to use it, how to make it work. We're going to do all of those things at the end of this, during this session. So by the end of this session, you will have a tool that you can use in your speech to pull your audience in and get them to remember your message, not just for now, but for a long, long time. Today, you'll get a phrase that will stay with you for days. To create a phrase that stays for days is a challenge. And there's several things you want to be aware of. And the first thing you want to be aware of is something that people don't think too much about. Because they don't think too much about it, they create speeches and they just after a while fade off their audience's mind. Maybe you created a speech like that. You created a speech and then a couple days later, people just don't seem to remember it. And that was the problem I had. Create a speech, but then people wouldn't remember the message. The phrase would not stay. And as a result, have to either keep giving the same speech over and over again to the same audience, or figure out a better way to connect with that audience. And there's one simple rule to keep in mind. One simple rule to create a phrase that stays for days. And that is to make sure you have less than 10 words. Less than 10 words. Or maximum of 10 words. Say 10 words or less. If you do that, 10 words or less, hopefully less, you'll be well on your path to creating that sort of phrase that people remember. A phrase that stays for days. Because when I started out creating these things, I'd create these different ideas and they'd be so complex people really wouldn't imagine them. They wouldn't be able to keep them in their head. So I'd create a speech about the importance of being nice to people who aren't really nice to you, and you still need to be nice to them anyway. That was the point of the speech. Might have even been a few lines in the speech like that. Be nice to people who are nice to you, because it's important to be nice to them even if they aren't nice to you. And then a couple days later I'd say to somebody who happened to hear the speech, say, just out of curiosity, do you remember what I said 2 days ago in that speech? And the person would say, Tim, 2 days ago, yeah, it was about something important. Yeah, it was about something important, and there was a horse or a duck. It was pretty important, I remember that. Keep your phrase short. Short phrase. As the phrase starts to go on and on and on, people don't remember that stuff. It doesn't stick in the mind. It doesn't stick up here. It's important to keep the phrase short. So start doing a word count. It's really simple to do. Just start counting. And if you find that your words are getting too much, then you must reduce those words so don't go too long. For instance, that would make a lousy phrase. Way too many words. Reduce down the number of words. Then you get a phrase that stays for days. Reduce down those number of words. 10 words or less. Ideally less than 10 words. 6 or 5, that's a good number. 7, maybe 8. But you get too many words in there, as you start to get past 10 or even at 10, it just gets a little bit too big. The problem with big phrases is they go right out of our mind. Right out of our mind. So remember something like, read my lips, no taxes. You can look that up if you don't remember it. Forget things like, the importance here, ladies and gentlemen, is to make sure we're progressive and progressively tax incremental measures in the previous tax year. Forget it. Don't remember that. Got to be less than 10 words. Now, once it's less than 10 words, you're on your way, but you still don't have a phrase that stays for days. There's something else very important you have to add in. even when you have a phrase that is less than 10 words, it still isn't enough to get that phrase to stick in the minds of your audience. To get a phrase that stays for days, you need something more. And until you have the second thing, you really don't have a chance of getting that sticky phrase you want. Sure, it's short, so they could remember it, but they won't want to. It won't matter to them. It won't have any sort of relevance. So to get a phrase that stays for days, there's a second thing that has to be there. Short, yes, but the second thing has to be there, or the phrase just goes away. After a couple of days, phrase is gone. Out of their heads, out of their mind, completely gone. And that second thing that you need is you need to have a you focus. You need to have a you focused phrase. For quite a while when I was speaking, I gave speeches, and even when I had a phrase, there was some sort of phrase there, the phrase didn't really have anything to do with the audience. It was something I was interested in. Give a talk about cars, maybe. And the phrase would be something about, here's some neat cars you can learn about. Here's some great cars you can see. Here's some great cars I can talk about. And just kind of talk about a bunch of different cars. Here's some cars, here's the specs in the cars, and all this kind of stuff. But it had no relevance to my audience. It was short enough. Neat cars. Here are some neat cars. Pretty much was the phrase. Sure, it's short. My audience wasn't car enthusiasts. They weren't excited about cars. They weren't interested in cars. So it really had nothing to do with them. It didn't connect with them. It wasn't relevant to them. It was something I was interested in, and they, quite frankly, weren't. So there was this huge disconnect, this huge problem in the phrase. The phrase just didn't work. Real neat cars. It's short. It's not relevant to the audience. So you have to get your phrase so it's you focused. It's focused on you. It's all there about you. When you're speaking, the audience is you, and the speaker is I. So I, talking about I, fine, but then I want to focus on you. And the phrase has to be all about you, the audience. It's a simple thing, it's a little thing, but it's the difference between remembering the phrase and completely forgetting the phrase. Because the whole reason to have a phrase that stays for days is so that afterwards, after your speech is done, long afterwards, days, weeks, months afterwards, people remember that speech and they remember that phrase. And it'll happen if you get a phrase that you focused. Has to do with the audience, has to do with the audience's interests are, has to do with something relevant to the audience. The phrase directly deals with them. The phrase directly benefits them. A you-focused phrase. It's so easy to get up here and get all caught up in I. I do this and I do that and I'm the speaker and I'm doing all these things. It's important as a speaker to always remember it's all about you. It's all about you. So the phrase you use, the phrase your audience takes with you, is a phrase that's relevant to you, the audience. A you-focused phrase. You don't have to use the word you in it. But it has to be very clear that it's all about the audience. It's all about you. That you can take the word you, stick it right in the phrase, and it'll be perfectly at home. So now you have a shorter phrase. A phrase that's you-focused. And there's one more thing you need. One more thing you need that'll really make that phrase stick and really make that phrase stay. now. You're almost there. You can just taste it. You've almost got a phrase that stays for days. Great thing is now you have a phrase that's short, easy to remember, sticks in people's minds. You made sure that the phrase is you-focused, so it connects in with your audience. Gets everybody involved and interested. But there's one thing still missing. One thing you still don't have. Until you have that, the phrase, it'll be there for a while and then it'll just go. It'll vanish. It'll go right out of people's heads. And then something new comes in and boom, push that old thing out. So even if you have a phrase that's short and a phrase that's focused on your audience, without this third thing, it just doesn't work. The connection just isn't there. And most important, the stickiness of the phrase just isn't there. To get a phrase that stays for days, you need to make sure your phrase is somehow musical. That's the way world champion Craig Valentine describes it. Musical. That there's some sort of sound about it that sticks in your mind. Some sort of repeating sound or syllable, and somehow that gets you going. And by now you've probably noticed that a phrase that stays for days is one of those sticky phrases. It's short, very much focuses the audience, it's a phrase that sticks with you for days, and it's kind of musical. Phrase, days, stays. There's kind of a music sound about that. Or rhythmic. Make it kind of rhythmic. And there are different ways to do that and bring that out of the phrase. Now, as I said, for a while, I was doing phrases like neat cars. Got a speech is all about neat cars. How interesting they are, exciting they are. They're really neato. Well, it was short. Anyway, you know, folks in the audience, you like cars, this is for you. But it didn't really work. Now, I might try something. Here's how you can get a cool car. Cool. There's a good word. Car. Those are great words because it sounds musical, it sounds rhythmic. There's a lyricism to it, to get a little fancy. That's a phrase that stays for days. Get your cool car here. Wow. It's you-focused, short, it's got all this interesting sound to it. It'll stick in people's mind. It's a phrase that stays for days. You put all this together, you got it. Most importantly, remember to get that musical sound. And it may take a little bit of work. You may try different things. Write down a listing of all the different words. Write down all the synonyms, all the antonyms, all the things that sound sort of like the word. Write down all the different meanings of the word. Play around with it. Let it sit in your mind a little bit. Let it kind of gel up there. And then it starts to gel as ideas start to come out. Then you finally get that phrase that stays for days. It's important to have a little bit of fun when you're creating a phrase. And that's where the lyricism, music comes out of it, the rhythmicness of it. When you're working on this, listen to music. Maybe take a look over lyrics that you really love that stick in your head and see what's there about them. Put that in your phrase. Now you have all the tools you need to create a phrase that stays for days. That's it. That's the tool. Those are the tools to creating a phrase that stays for days. It begins with making sure that the phrase is something that's 10 words or less. Short phrases stick in the mind. They just stick in the mind and they capture our attention. If it becomes too long, if it goes on and on, it's going to get out of there. It's going to get lost. And then it won't work. So that short phrase sticks in the mind. So first, make sure that you give that very short phrase. Very short phrase out there, because that sticks. Once you have the short phrase, then you can start thinking about making sure that it's focused on you. Make sure the phrase is interesting and captures the audience's attention and works. It has to be about you. It's all about you. Every speech we give is for your benefit. Benefit of the audience. Phrase has to make that clear. Somehow, you has to be either spelled out in the phrase or suggested, hinted at. And then you will hear it and say, ah, this is a phrase for me. I'll remember that. You create a phrase that stays. Now, short phrase, great. You focus, sure, it's a phrase that stays. How do you make it a phrase that stays for days? It doesn't just go away. That's the last part. You want to make sure that the phrase is somehow musical, somehow it's rhythmic. Play around with words. Have some fun with words. Try different words and see which words work. Rhyming works very well. Or if you can repeat the same letter. Cool cars is better than nice cars. It's better than okay automobiles. You want to have the alliteration sound. How to get yourself a cool car. That phrase that could stay for days. Make some little work on it, little tweaking, but it's got the basics there. The basics are down, it can go from there. Make sure when you're doing this that you have a phrase that is rhythmic and musical. Once you have those, you have the keys to the phrase that stays for days. It's all right there. The next step is to take a step. Make sure you go out there and practice this. Take a look over your speeches. If you haven't written a speech, create one. Take a look over the speech, work at it, and start figuring out, okay, where can I create this phrase? What is the whole speech about? Once you understand what the whole speech is about, then you can start to create the phrase. Okay, this is a phrase that's going to stick. This is a phrase that people are going to remember. This is a phrase that underlines everything I'm talking about out there. And the thing about it is you can hear about all this stuff, but until you actually apply it in your speech, you don't realize the power. You don't realize the way that this can really, really powerfully impact your audience. You don't realize this connects with your audience. You have to apply these things. Don't apply them, they go away. And that's the way it works. You want to become a better speaker, you want to become a better communicator, you have to apply the basics. And one basics is that phrase that just sticks in your head. It's like a song you can't get out of your head. It's there, it's always there, and as time goes on, oh yeah, that's right, I remember that song, I remember that phrase. How does that go? Oh yeah. That's the power of song, and that can be the power of your speech if you go through and follow the keys we talked about. The keys are so important in your speech. Use them. You'll have the audience palm of your hand.